one over there, and there's one here as well. So we'd love to have your questions. You must be brimming with ideas and questions you'd like to put to our panel.
This one there. If you could just wait for the microphone to arrive and say who you are before you speak.
Thank you. Terry Friedman. It's really a question for Andy, but anyone else on the panel who has an opinion of this. I was just wondering if there are transition problems when children who are not used to open minds, that curriculum or that framework, come into your school, or the other way around, actually, you know, when children have done it in primary schools and then go on to a secondary school that doesn't do it. Thanks.
Okay. Well, obviously, one of the reasons we chose to do Opening Minds at Redbridge Community Schools to actually aid the transition from the primary to the secondary schools. We felt it was very hard for the children within our catchment area to go from having so much curriculum time with one teacher to suddenly coming to a new school where they're having possibly 12 teachers within the same week. We actually felt that it was very valuable for them to have extended curriculum time, normally about 1/3 of their total classroom time with the same teacher. And obviously the dividends of that pays that they're building a relationship with that teacher. The teacher gets to know them and a lot better than say their PE teachers or their maths teachers. And therefore we find that actually that brings in another area of learning where they can actually come to you, talk to you off the record. You know, we actually tackle more than just classroom concerns. We then start to look at being the confident for these people when it comes to bullying or indeed when there are things happening at home. They come out and they come and speak to us about that. So we've actually found that the transition has been aided by Opening Minds, but also that now we've got students that have gone through Opening Minds and they've got younger siblings that are waiting to come through. They're fully prepared, they know what to expect, and obviously we have a very good transition officer at the school who goes in. I don't actually get the time to go to the school myself, but the transition officer who is very involved in Opening Minds when we kicked it off, she goes to the school and discusses that, and any problems come to me. Okay.
Any more questions? Yes, one there in the middle.
Hi, it's Nikki Featherstone from Staffordshire, and this probably seems like harassment now, Andy, because it's another one for you. But as it was about opening minds at the primary school, and you're the one that's actually doing it, although not in a primary school. You talked in your presentation this morning about how incidents of ineffective behaviour had gone down in those opening mind sessions. Had that been replicated in the other sessions that the children did that weren't on the opening minds? So were they transferring those skills? And has there been any impact in terms of their levels of literacy and numeracy, which you said were low when they came in? Has there been any evidence of accelerated progress in those areas which you could, which you think that the Opening Minds approaches have contributed to?
Okay, I'll start with the first question first of all. In terms of the behaviour, I think what I said in my presentation this morning is we operate an on-call system where the students are removed, disruptive students are removed from lessons where they have been given 3 prior chances. If they're not taking the ones, they will be removed. Now, if you think that the students in Year 7 are having 30 lessons a week, at the time, we're down to 8 lessons a week now with Opening Minds. For all of the total on-calls for last year, I believe there's something in between 150 and 185 on-calls in Year 7. Only about 7% of those came from their Opening Minds lessons, where they were obviously more engaged in their learning and the activities they were doing. So, of course, that's a clear indicator of where their behaviour is improved in Opening Minds. Now, obviously, part of the problem is that we are tackling as a school at the moment is the transferable skills. We're currently looking into why can the students draw a graph in maths, but they can't always transfer that graph into humanities, for example. So we're looking at working more as a whole school department, as I would say, to tackle those issues. Can you remind me of your second point, please?
Yeah, you said that your students came in with low levels of literacy
Yeah.
and numeracy, and was there any evidence of accelerated progress in those? So were there any impacts on standards of literacy and mathematics, perhaps by the end of Year 9, that you could perhaps that you feel that the Open Minds approaches have contributed to? So has it impacted on standards as
Okay. Okay, thank you. In terms of where we started with Opening Minds, I mean, we have been operating it now for about 6 years. The key emphasis initially was on the understanding of learning, the competencies and the skills, and that was where all the focus was. But you're right to ask that question, something that I've definitely been involved in the last year, probably more so now that my line manager is the head of literacy strategy in the school as well now. An area that I have actually identified myself is that, yes, we do need to start to put more of the whole school literacy strategies into the Opening Minds curriculum so that we're, again, such as with the graphs in the humanities and the maths department, we are tackling the same issues that the English are tackling because we are in fact seeing them more often than the English department. So that's something that we are impacting on. Now, in terms of whole school improvement, the school's GCSE grades have actually improved consistently over the last 4 years. And if you look at the fact that I am actually a geography teacher myself, humanities teacher, our humanities and geography GCSE passes have actually increased in line with the school as well. So I would say, to an effect, they are using some of the skills, they're transferring them as they move up the school. But if you also remember that we have a lot of other whole school sort of theories that we apply, and I think all of these combined with the input they're getting in year 7 and how we're following that up with year 8, 9, 10 and 11 and the mentoring that goes on is actually having an impact. However, the literacy is something that currently I'm looking at increasing more so because of my line manager at the moment. He's taken a much more bigger interest into Opening Minds.
Mick was just going to come in.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just, I think it's a really important point. And you know, there's no doubt to me that there has to be a correlation between engaged and confident children, no matter what their innate abilities are, and outcomes. But I think the caveat to that is it may be not yet. So, I mean, there was a wonderful school, actually it was a really tough school, Manton School up in North Nottinghamshire. And the head there spends an awful lot of time getting the community together, a completely disenfranchised community. Spent a lot of his time getting the community together, making sure there are great opportunities in the school. School was fun, but there was a work ethic as well. He was hounded out of his school because his SAT results hadn't gone up fast enough. Now it will happen, and he said it's coming. But you know, and actually, interestingly, the year he went out, suddenly there was an enormous improvement. So I think it's a bit like, you know, this connecting, going on training courses, and what's the impact on you? Well, sometimes, so what's the impact on you going to be about being out of school for today? And some of those things you can't measure easily. And unfortunately, we're in a system where everything, you know, everything has to be measured. And I think we have to measure the things we value. And having those attitudes going into secondary school and continuing them in secondary school has to be a brilliant platform eventually for learning and confidence and growing, you know, and growing skills, whatever they are. And the trouble is in primary that we're actually afraid to go there a bit, and we think we've got to keep rehearsing the tests, otherwise, you know, we're not going to get those results that we want. Sorry to keep harking back to that. Absolutely. I agree. Yeah. Well.
Just to put a primary perspective on that, I'm a head teacher at a primary school in Leicester. We've seen through doing Opening Minds that we've got far better pupil engagement. Their attendance levels have increased. As Mick just said, enjoyment for them. The secret for us was we had to make school more exciting and interesting than what's at home. As a result of that, our exclusion figures have plummeted by about 80% over the last 2 years.
Hello, Tony Markham, head of a junior school in Petersfield. Interested, Pete, in your experience about Opening Minds, because my experience as a head, it's not the children that I need to open the minds of, it's often the adults. So because Opening Minds touches on so many elements that we've had in primary education, what did you do to make it feel like something fresh and new?
We're not quite as far down the line as Andy. I mean, we used to do Opening Minds. There was a change of leadership. I became the head. School went into special measures, long tail, etc. We basically had to go back and unpick it all and decide which were the elements that worked for our children at our school. That was the key for us, what's right for the children at Knighton Fields. You're right, a lot of opening minds to do with adults, and I include staff in that as well. We're quite unique, I think. We've got quite a very young, inexperienced staff. We've had quite a lot of staff turnover in the last few years, 70% new in the last 3 years. We've got nobody above UPS. In fact, nobody's gone through the threshold in the school. They're either well below, sort of most experienced teacher outside the leadership team is on M4. So actually they're still keen to develop and learn. So that's been actually quite useful to take them down that opening minds as part of their CPD and the whole school inset we've done. As it comes to parents, the previous head did things like creativity days. I won't go into the whys and wherefores of that. But they were actually they were liked by the parents and the children. But it was actually making sure that there was a bit more rigour, I think was the word that was used earlier. That rigour was actually in there, so there was actually some outcomes for them at the end of the day. But it is, it's like all change management really, making sure everybody's involved. We had a working party which involved site manager, secretaries, TAs, teachers, all the way up throughout the school, so it was owned by everybody.
I think I'd just come in on that quickly as well, just to emphasise that really opening minds, one of the reasons why you might leave today not really having a very clear structure in your head about how opening minds is done is because it's not done in any particular way across the board. I mean, schools really do take the ideas and the framework and make it their own and do what suits their school and what feels like it's lacking and what feels like it needs freshening up or what feels like needs turning on its head perhaps. So I think that's one of certainly the strengths of opening minds. I think Matthew's theme in his speech at the beginning of the day was that it can be a weakness, it can be something that is difficult, but I think the biggest danger, the bigger danger really is seeing something that works in another school, thinking fantastic, and adopting it wholesale for your school, because that we've found is what often leads to problems, because actually what you need to do is really kind of, it needs to come from yourselves and from the school itself.
I mean, I hope that what you've got from today is confirmatory, that actually what you are doing, your values in school are absolutely spot on, and don't be persuaded to change that course. And if it's confirmation, I think that's just so important. If you go back in your schools and say, yeah, what we're doing is right, and actually having this broad and creative and exciting curriculum, which is going to turn children onto learning sooner or later, is absolutely right. And you know, my experience is that's what primary education has been about ever since I've been in it, which is a long, long time. And I think we just need to return to those values and make sure that that's what we're doing.
Hello, my name's Julia Robson. I'm from a school in Sheffield. I've got a question really for Mick Brookes and Sir Jim Rose about, can you hear me? About curriculum refocus and assessment. And it stems from last July. We had a writing review group with our Year 6 children at the end of Key Stage 2. And what those children said was, you know, for the moment, they accept that Year 6 children have to have SATs, and they might not like it, but that's the way things are. But if they do badly in science, and I'm talking about, they were last year's children, there's always part of the paper that they can do. You know, if you get stuck on one part, you can do another part. If you get stuck in the maths paper, you can do most of it. But if you get stuck on the writing paper, then you're just stuck. Absolutely. And they said, can't we have a choice? Yeah. And so that's my question is, you know, if you're in those rooms with the people from the National Assessment Agency, please can you ask them, can the children have a choice? Because if we want engaged children, if we want enthusiastic children, then teaching them all about writing and not giving them a choice just seems the wrong approach.
I'm going to let Jim go first here, but I had a great idea. Why not get them to write about a trainer?
How about what?
A trainer.
Trainer.
A trainer.
This was the writing SAT last year, Jim.
Right. Right. Okay. I'm with you 100% of the way. I mean, I do think that there should be some way, and it's not beyond the wit of man to invent a choice, if you like, pattern. I think a lot of this business, really, it stems from not really having confidence in a system which somehow or other will allow us to measure standards over time. And that's been a real issue as far as SATS is concerned. And it's this business of, you know, if you want to measure change, don't change the measure. So you're then in this awful groove of having to stick with it and try and make every year's SATs look like the year before but different. And it really is a struggle. Tell me I'm wrong, but when I go into schools, there's that problem, and almost equal to it is what every head said to me just about on every of the 60 or so visits that we made for the primary review. It's the league table presentation that really is causing us the pain, as well as all of that. I mean, we've got to be able to do better than that, surely. I travel in the faith that if we get the curriculum right, we then start asking questions about assessment. I think it's such a big wicket that it does need a bit of separate treatment, Nick. So, I mean, I was more concerned and interested in wrestling with the curriculum than necessarily with the SATs. That group that sat, and I was on it because of the curriculum tie-up, to pronounce on the requirements of assessment and testing. I don't know whether you remember, whether you had the chance to read the report, but there were these strange anomalies that science, for example, it was the convincing argument for dropping science was because the maths and English results gave you a better indication of science, right, capability than did the science test. And what does that tell you? It tells you the science test must have been something about, well, it couldn't have been much about science. It was probably a pencil and paper test, which was language comprehension, very close to, right? So now we're looking at the reality of, if we want to assess science, trusting teachers to do it. So things are sort of retrospectively coming into place, and I just hope we can keep them on the horizon. Actually, yes, I'm pointing to this guy because I think he probably is the nearest thing we've got to keeping him on the horizon, as it were.
Well, yeah, thank you. I mean, we're certainly doing that. Absolutely agree with you. I think, and I'll share this with you in some confidence, that where we've got to, and possibly for 2010, if the tests go ahead, and that's an if the tests go ahead, then they will be considered alongside teacher assessment. Because I think it's an absolute insult to you that this proxy for children's learning is, and your view of assessment is completely ignored. So that may be a place we go. So, and if schools are allowed to establish their own independent markers, I think the marking of maths and actually the comprehension element and spelling in English and maths is right, but the marking of writing is very, very difficult. And there's a degree of subjectivity in there. So I absolutely agree with you. Some children actually will get off on writing about a trainer. Other children will get off on writing fantasy stories, and other children actually like writing letters and things like that. So let's look at their strengths and measure their strengths rather than try and find out how they're weak. So I think you're spot on there.
That's what they were saying.
Yeah.
They
Yeah. Yeah.
They were only 10 or 11 and they were saying that, and that just seemed intrinsically wrong. It's not what we've been talking about today.
That's absolutely right. And if they go into the secondary sector with that self-image, I think the guys in secondary stand no chance whatsoever.
Barry Wise, I'm a retired teacher. I've been working with the Opening Minds programme since the year 2000. And I just want to respond to the question about getting your staff involved, because it's a very fundamental and basic question. If you want to do this in school and your staff are not interested, that's a very difficult problem for you. What I would say is, because it's a problem that many schools meet, is if you can find a couple of staff to start with their classes, work on some project-based work, there may be other people who you can say, look, we're doing a project on so-and-so. Could you actually help us by doing a bit of work in your area and feeding into this? And at the end of your first half term, it's your youngsters who actually persuade the rest of your staff, because they prepare a project which they present to the rest of the staff, and it's the sheer excitement and joy and fun of learning that they've experienced, which the rest of your staff could not fail to recognize. And they are the greatest advocates for getting learning and teaching right. They will show your teachers the way to do it.
Barry. Right, any further questions and comments? One lady here, yes.
Hello, Janine Shardlow from South Norwood. I'm primary science AST, and I work with a lot of schools across South London. And one of the points I'd like to make is that if we're looking at the training of teachers in the primary area, we need to look very carefully at their training in science, because there is not a lot of confidence out there amongst a lot of primary teachers in how to teach or even understand the subject, let alone assess it accurately. So we need to put the horse before the cart in this issue. One area you mentioned about children not being able to transfer their skills is, say, for instance, in graphing. I've been working on a completely integrated science, maths and literacy for about 10 years in about 5 different schools. And my observation is they don't transfer their ability to graph because they've learnt it in a maths lesson. But if they learn it because they need to use it in science or geography, they know why they're learning it. They understand it's their data that they're representing. They can talk about it with confidence, and they know that it is a mechanism that they can then apply in other areas. And I think this wholesale drive for literacy and maths in isolation of any kind of application is where we are failing, if we're failing anywhere, in primary education. I won't mention secondary because I'm not an expert in that field. But the sooner we get children learning because they need that skill, the better our children will be educated and be able to apply.
Do any of you want to comment on that?
I think we just need to watch the sleight of hand in the sense that, how did you put it? The overall drive, as if nothing else mattered in primary schools. I think certainly there's a grain of truth in that, but most primary schools I go into also have got enough common sense and control not to let it be, you know, a grad grind, 5-hour day concentration on literacy and numeracy. There's a much more intelligent debate that's being developed, I think, now as to how you actually develop literacy and numeracy through the richness of a broad and balanced curriculum than ever there was. We're much more intelligent in the use of, hopefully, the research into reading and writing and the need to understand that. I mean, I do think we took a bit of a wrong turn, frankly, when we put the strategies on the Searchlights track, because, you know, there was no real hard research supporting that. And we are, although it didn't do what I would call unutterable damage, and certainly some children did make considerable progress, we could do better. And it's that could do better in terms of, I think, pedagogy that we're always going to be reaching for. And we just need to be a bit careful about, you know, saying that primary schools are forever kind of hammering on the anvil of literacy and numeracy. At the same time, we do need to make sure they give proper attention to it. You've made a very important point about, as it were, English, maths and science. Because if there are 3 subjects that ever come together and should come together, they are the 3. I mean, you can get an amazing amount of synergy between those 3, doing exactly what you said, because science, if anything, offers all that wonderful opportunity for measurement, maths, calculation, and so on and so forth. And what Ofsted found year after year after year, never mind about Ofsted, what HMI found year after year after year, is that business about, you know, we can teach children, they can know about, if you like, addition, multiplication, blah, blah, blah. They can actually demonstrate the skills, but when you actually put them in a problem-solving situation where they've got to actually use and apply them, that's where they fall down. Hence, thankfully, we are now, whatever we're talking about, RSA, you know, and so on and so forth, talking about, aren't we, bringing together knowledge and skills to yield understanding, competency and capability, which is a totally different perspective from the one we had, certainly when I started teaching.
My one concern, obviously, because I'm a holocaust of science, is that as of the announcement of the end of SATs, there has been a general consensus now that science at primary level doesn't matter. We don't have to worry about it. And I know I'm not looking for business, but I won't get any. And also the British Science Association has noticed a downturn.
Yeah.
Rising stars, people are just switched off. They do not want to know about science because now they think it's not really important. It's not being tested.
I think we should just can we hang on to this for 2 seconds? Because I really think you've got a very important line. I mean, first of all, there is all this business about certainly making sure teachers have the best possible support for science. And whatever subjects, actually, if we're talking about subject definition, and by that I think we mean actually introducing children to the discourse of the subject. I could give you example after example of how that works and how it looks in progression terms, certainly within science. What I think we ought to be exploiting much, much more, I mean, if I see, as I did last night, Attenborough's presentation of fish and life in the sea and God knows what, I mean, look at the richness that we've now got, which we can simply reach out for if we actually use the ICT properly. And it's not just for children. It's actually helping teachers, I think, come to a better understanding of science. If we can get some of those managed learning environments shaped in that way. And I think we ought to, really work hard, actually, at doing more of that. Thinking in terms of benefiting the teacher's background knowledge and skills, as it were, for whatever we want to do with children. So, there is opportunity now, I think, to do that much more effectively. And hopefully that's what the QCDA
well, hopefully it will either be designed into the teacher training or into CPD, but there isn't a lot of good quality primary CPD around.
Yeah, but the ASE, I know, are actually very interested in taking this forward, and certainly those who are also equally, status in technology. And that's also going to be interesting, to see whether we can bring science and technology together.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got time for squeeze one more very, very quick comment or question in, because I know you're all desperate to get your trains and things, so... Got one more? Yep, you've got one. Sorry, people.
Hello.
Thank you very much.
Keith Hockney, Year 6 teacher. I'd like to address my comments to Jim. I agree with you totally about what you said about this, and it builds on the lady's comments about what you said about the science SATs, because it has become a literacy test, basically, under Science for All. And I'd also like to build on what you've said about the teaching. I picked up in your report where you mentioned about teachers may not have enough subject knowledge to take on and challenge the more gifted pupils. I wonder if there's a case to be thought of in years 5 and 6 towards the latter part of primary, where the teachers could actually be developed more on the secondary model of those with those specialist abilities being used more in a specialist role, without dissolving the primary ethos, if you like.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a working...
Well, yes, that also. I mean, there used to be a thing called the Three Wise Men report. I don't know if you remember it, way back in the dim and distant. And one of the issues which really we tried to make sure was nailed there was this business of whether we could get a bit more, whether we call it specialist teaching or whatever. I mean, it's this question about discourse of the subject, isn't it? I mean, if we're talking, and we must be serious about progression. It's no good thinking that we can plateau year on year with children, just keeping them interested and on the sort of, boil, as it were. We've got to have something which is much more, I think, focused on how we win progression, and that can only come through increased expertise. And how we achieve that, I mean, whether there's opportunity for secondary teachers to come in and work alongside rather than replace, right, for a while. And I think that goes all the way down the line, by the way. I mean, I'd like to see a good deal more cooperation between Year 1 and Year R teachers, and at all those transition points where we're sometimes seeing a sag in progress. But you raise, again, a very important point as to how we get that expertise in.
Because if I can just add to that, I think that's where this particular jump from Year 6 to Year 7 with this, a lot of this perceived skills deficit that seems to come in between the primary secondary argument can be the fact that it's just a total change of a teaching environment for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to finish off on that one, I mean, we put forward this rather, I suppose it's a very ambitious idea, but I would like to see it tried. Some secondary heads have said they're already doing it, which is starting a study in primary Year 6, third term, and carrying it through to secondary and seeing whether we can get some linkage in that way. Right. And I spoke today to somebody here who's doing that work in drama. Where are you? The Argentinians, that's right. All our kids are going to be taught to tango. I mean, but are already doing some of this work where they're carrying forward a project in music, movement, drama. Fantastic. From primary into secondary. So, you know, we could kind of broaden the horizon as to how we think about some of that, I think.
Right, thank you very much. I think that's all.
Well, that'll do it, won't it? But that should help, shouldn't it?
I don't think it's quite as straightforward as that necessarily, but we can certainly carry on this conversation afterwards. I'm sure we'll be very happy to have that conversation with you. So, Julian.
Okay, well, I just want to finish off with a few thank yous. Firstly, a big thank you to all our speakers. I think please join me in thanking Barry Shim and Andy Bone, Sir Jim Rose and Mick Brookes. I personally want to say a big thank you to Louise, Pam and all the RSA staff for putting the day on today, but I just want to say, yeah, thank you for that, yeah.